All right, ready. I'm gonna make hopefully a really quick video on some issues I just ran into on replacing the rotors and brake pads on a 2011, which is the 5th gen 4runner. This 4runner, my now wife bought brand new in 2011, and she drove it for, I guess 6 or 7 years before we got together, and she did all the services through like a good year. And then when we got together, I do all my own services, so I kind of took that over. And recently, I noticed that I was getting a shimmy at about 60 miles an hour, and after inspecting the rotors, they were starting to get some nice wear to them, and in my opinion, the rotor was causing the shimmy. Plus, they need to replace, and if it hadn't been the rotor, then at least start there. But they need to be replaced. So the moral of the story is, or the reason for the story is, I needed to replace all the rotors and the brake pads. I was doing my best to not replace the calipers because calipers are super expensive. So I started on the front and immediately ran into a huge problem. Now, if you do work on your own vehicles, you may have run into this before. The front calipers on a 4runner, I don't know how far this goes back, but it's a one-piece caliper. In my opinion, it is not a good design. I prefer to have a two-piece caliper with the top that comes off, bolts hold it in, just a lot easier to work on. In the 4runner, you have these pins that run through the caliper, through the top of the brake pads, and then there's a pin that holds it in place. Now, what I found in this case, and I'm really good about servicing my vehicles, is that when I went to try to get these pins out, they had completely rusted to the caliper. And I know people are going to be like, oh, use a little penetrating oil, or try to tap it from the backside. I did all that stuff. The problem is you start tapping this from the backside, where has a little lip. They go in from the outside of the wheel towards the inside of the fender well, and you can try to tap the backside of this, but if you tap it, put too much force on it, it will start to mushroom, and then there's no way that's going to go through that hole. So what I ended up having, I tried penetrating oil, I tried tapping it, tried getting a set of vice grips on the back of these. This thing was solidly rusted to that caliper. So all I could do was I removed the caliper with the brake pads and the pins in it from the rotor. And I ended up, I guess I could have cut the pins off, try to mess with it, but at that point I was so irritated that what I did was I went to an O'Reilly's Auto Parts, and I called them, and they were able to get me a new set of calipers the next day. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of advice. Most of you might know this already, but like if you have the dealership and they say you need to replace the calipers, they're going to charge you for a full set of calipers. But in most cases, you can return the old calipers. It's called a core returnment, almost like with a battery. If you have a dead battery, you can return the core and get a discount on the calipers. In my case, the new calipers were $200, and I got $100 off by turning in the old calipers, and they'll end up refurbishing those and selling them again. So what I ended up doing is I took both calipers off, and when I went in to buy the new calipers, I just took them with me and ended up paying $100 per caliper. Now, I ordered new hardware, and this is another thing. You gotta be careful when you're buying calipers. Oftentimes, they won't come with the hardware you need. It'll just be the caliper. So make sure that when you order calipers that you're getting all the hardware. And with the Toyota 4runner. I don't know if it works for the Tacoma and stuff. I'm just talking for a 5th gen Toyota 4runner now. I had to order a hardware kit for the calipers too. Now the interesting thing is when I was examining the old caliper, the pins that were fixed in there, they didn't use this. This is a retaining clip that goes in. I guess if I really gave a shit, I could have had the tire off showing you the caliper, but if you're doing this, you have some type of mechanical sense. So basically, pretend I stuck the pin through the caliper, through both brake pads, and it come out the backside, and there's a little hole there. This little retaining clip goes through that hole, just like so. Let me get it all the way through. And then there's a little, see this little clip on here? That actually clips in to a hole on the backside of the caliper. And what that does is that holds those pins, retains those pins in the caliper. Now my old caliper didn't have this. They had little individual cotter pins. So just one little pin went through this one, and this one had another one. And what that allowed these pins to do was to slide all over, because if this retaining clip holds those pins in place. So once this is locked in the caliper, these pins don't move back and forth. If you get a lower end caliper or a hardware kit, they'll give you individual cotter pins, and what that allowed these to do was to move freely. And what happens is they slid all the way up against the caliper, and I couldn't get a pair of vice grips or anything on the end of this thing to get them out. So what I ended up doing was I ordered a hardware kit with pins that are slightly longer. And what that allowed me to do was, when I put this retaining clip on at the end, this end of the pin stuck out from the caliper about 1/4 of an inch, just long enough so that when I do have to get these off again, I have plenty of surface area to get a pair of vice grips on to work these things out. And what else I did was I placed, you can see I use this a lot. This is just brake parts lubricant. You would basically brush this onto any of your brake parts that like two surfaces move together. So like you would put this on the back of your brake pad where the piston touches, and to keep it from squealing. It just gives it something in between it to just, I mean, the calipers, pistons have been known to make some noise. I've never had that issue, but I like to do that, and I also like to put it on the tips of the brake pads where they seat into the caliper. Like you have these replacement pieces that the brake pads will sit down in there. You put a little bit in there. It's just easier to get those brake pads out at the end. But what I did was I put a light coat of this brake parts lubricant on the pin, so that as it goes through the holes, there's just a light layer of lubricant to allow the pin, when I go to take this thing out, to actually slide out, as opposed to just completely fusing to that brake caliper. So that's really my story. I just wanted to let you know that you can order these pins in a slightly longer version. It's like a 1/2 inch longer, just to give you, and then if you make sure you use the right retaining clip. So this will go into both pins, and like I said, it'll clip into the back side of the caliper, and it holds those pins in place. It doesn't allow them to slide back and forth, and it'll give you just enough room to be able to get a wrench on when you got to replace these. Believe me, I'm like the king of maintenance on vehicles. I was amazed at how quickly these things seized up, and I'm not even in the Rust Belt. I'm in Virginia, where we don't really have much winters, and I'm constantly cleaning my vehicle. But that entire caliper the pins in it were seized all the way up. Now the rear calipers are a 2-piece caliper. That was very easy. I was able to get the bolts out and replace I was actually able to put the existing old calipers back onto the new rotors on the back of the vehicle. No problem at all. Super simple. Everything about them was in great condition, and the sad thing is the front calipers were in really good shape. The rings around the The pistons were all in great shape. It was just these stupid pins that Toyota decided to design a one-piece caliper. This is the weak point in that whole system, is just these crappy little pins. And they're really a pain in the ass to get out if they get any bit of rust on them. So, you know, take it for what it's worth. If it helps you out, that's great. I know from now on I will be using the slightly longer pins and putting a slight coat of brake lubricant on it, and making sure that I'm always using the proper retaining clip as opposed to the little cheap little cotter pins that some kits come with. Anyway, that's my story. So I ended up replacing all the rotors. And just another little piece of advice, those rotors were a bear. They were, you know, firmly seated on the hub. And, you know, I was tapping them, couldn't get them to move. Well, if you didn't know this as well, rotors have threaded holes in them. And what I ended up doing was finding 2 bolts that were these are a coarse thread. You know, you find a coarse thread. I don't remember exactly what these were, but I just screwed them right in, just kept threading them in one at a time, and eventually they will pop that rotor off without having to sit there and beat the crap out of it with a hammer. So replaced the rotors, ended up having to replace the metal brake lines that run to the rubber ones, because as I was getting the old calipers off, I bent them just slightly, and I mean, I'm sure I could have used them again, but these are like $8 a piece from the dealership, so I went ahead and replaced those on the front calipers. I replaced all the brake pads, and then went through the process of bleeding the system, which is no fun. But now my braking system is awesome, and again, it took care of my wobble or shimmy I had at about 60 miles an hour, so it was the rotors. My next project, which I don't know if I'll make a video on it or not, but the 4runner has about 100,000 miles on it, and I don't think that my wife has serviced the transmission. It's supposed to be one of these sealed transmissions that you're not supposed to have to service, but everything needs to be serviced. So I went and bought some of the ATF WS transmission fluid, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to drain the pan. I'm going to measure how much I drained. I'm going to then fill that exact amount back into the drain fill on the transmission, and I'm going to drive it for 5,000 miles to my next oil change, and then that's how I'm going to maintain the transmission from now on, because I shouldn't lose. When I do that, it should be like 3.5 quarts. They sell, I would definitely recommend getting a Toyota transmission fluid. Sell them in 6 quarts to a little case. They're about $13 a quart. Well worth it. So that's what I'm going to do over the next, probably for the rest of the life of the vehicles. I'm just going to do that little flush. It's not a flush. I hate when people say that. You should never flush a transmission. Drain. I'm going to drain the transmission, refill it with the exact same amount. The next 5,000 miles, same thing again. Next 5,000 miles, and just keep doing that now for the life of the vehicle, just to keep the fluid fresh, but not shock the system in case the fluid is getting a bit old. If the fluid is, I'm hoping, I haven't looked at it yet, fluid does seem to thicken over time, and it has been known to, if you were to completely drop the pan, drain the whole transmission and refill it, the fluid is much thinner, has been known to cause your transmission that was working before to start slipping and then need to have it rebuilt. So I'm hoping it's not at that point. It's running great right now. Transmissions and the Toyotas are pretty much bulletproof. But that's just the way I'm going to do it. Some people might criticize me for that, but that's just how I'm going to go about doing it. Just a little at a time, replacing it. I know that I'm not getting anything into the torque converter right now. Some people recommend draining the pan, measuring it, putting it back in, starting the vehicle up, running through the gears, doing it again, doing the same thing, 3 or 4 times. If the fluid doesn't look too bad, I mean, really, I might end up doing that if the fluid looks kind of bad, but if it's not too bad, I think I'm just going to do it this one time, wait 5,000 miles, do it again, and so forth and so on. Anyway, I'm rambling at this point. This video is really about the caliper pins, which are just a horrible design. And hopefully if it helps anybody out, that's great. But I'll talk to you later. Bye.